Good day and welcome to my channel. My name is Rod Mackenzie and today I want to talk about how Elon Musk has exposed how the British government has carried out an extensive clandestine operation spreading lies and misinformation about Russia. I will also illustrate how the media is also complicit in this anti-Russia propaganda operation. Now, someday, maybe after the government 30-year rule has passed over and the top secret stamp on the files and the faded dusty folders, we will learn the full details of the clandestine UK special psychological operations against Russia. These are the operations that the South African-American billionaire and free speech advocate Elon Musk exposed by simply turning the view function on the profiles of the social network X users into a tool for exposing the thousands of British-Ukrainian psychological operation agents with the flick of a wrist. Now, the profile of all these liars and disinformation peddlers now shows their geographic location, where their account was created, and their renaming history. Even according to the most basic data available, this has been a devastating blow for the British and Ukrainian intelligence services, or so-called intelligence services. Suddenly and irrevocably, the countless number of Ukrainian volunteers, activists, doctors, Odessa women, Kiev women, and all manner of so-called suffering civilians in the Russian-occupied or being bombed areas were exposed as complete liars and frauds. Now, anyone can see with their own eyes that the Ukrainians so-called dying under Russian bombs, who were demonstrating their nation's resilience and character to both global and domestic audience, were actually comfortably running their accounts on X, or formerly Twitter, from the comfort of London, Paris, Warsaw and Tel Aviv homes, using money provided by the British government. Now, this exposure is doubly embarrassing and painful for the British because it coincides with the recent statements from Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SBR, which is the abbreviation stands for Sluzhya Venezhny Razvedki, which translates as the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. And that's claiming that Britain is doing all it can to try and undermine the US brokered peace agreement in the Ukraine, including through using information leaks and provocations. Now, this is where the confusion lies. It's no secret, as part of the division of the anti-Russia efforts with other European countries, the British are responsible for the specialist and cyberspace operations, as well as the further information warfare. Now, it's common knowledge that significant resources and manpower are allocated to this. The new National Security Strategy, which was approved in June this year, explicitly states that the UK is in a state of strategic confrontation with Russia. Now, just a few days ago, the Council on Geostrategy, which is allegedly a think tank linked directly to British intelligence services, clarified for those who don't actually get it. The UK's fundamental objective remains what it has always been: to prevent the emergence of hostile actors and powers in Europe that exploit other European and non-European countries, thereby reducing the efforts of the British taxpayer. Currently, the greatest threat to the UK interests is Russia, and in case anyone hadn't realised it yet, Russia is the main mortal enemy of the UK. The Strategic Defence Review, the document that sets out the UK's military and defence policy for the next 10 years, states the following. The first strike in a future conflict will most likely be carried out on an invisible front. In other words, information warfare against Russia is an even more important task for Great Britain than developing its non-virtual armed forces and a nuclear arsenal. Now, before I continue, I'd like to tell you about my Patreon. I've launched a new Patreon on my channel, because there's so much I can't actually say and tell you on YouTube without risking my channel being shut down by the media censorship campaign. So on my Patreon, you'll get the real news I cannot post on here, with my analysis of what the fuck's really going on in my reports from here in Russia. News that often gets repressed. Those of you who have watched my videos in the past know that the quality of my content and the level of my insight is high. So please join my Patreon at BRICS Insight. As a member, you'll get 3 to 4 exclusive videos a week, plus commentary and direct access to me for questions and answers. The link full there is down below in the credits. Now, less than a year after the so-called Revolution of Dignity in Kiev, or what was actually the CIA and Vicky fuck the EU Newlands Maidan coup in Kiev, it appears that the British established a civilian national cyber security centre and set up a psychological information and operations unit within its armed forces, well, specifically known as the 77th Brigade. These uniformed personnel in this unit produce and post seemingly innocent memes, photos and videos. Now, the primary goal is to conduct information operations against Russian-speaking audiences, as well as to disseminate disinformation and provocation in the Western information sphere. However, despite all of these efforts, the result of this activity has been modest at best. So that's why a decision was made earlier this year to create a new agency with a rather telling name, the National Disinformation Agency. And this is not a joke. We're in an era where even October's darkest fantasies have become reality. Now, according to a report by the UK's Royal United Services Institute, modern disinformation campaigns succeed primarily through the manipulation of genuine information. Now, these operations are way able to go beyond what intelligence agencies can actually achieve using conventional means. Now, Elon Musk has helped reveal the true scale of British activity in this area. However, given the vast sums currently being invested by the West in the development of neural networks and artificial intelligence, all of that's now going to be particularly insignificant. OpenAI's June 2025 Threat Intelligence Report states that AI-enabled disruption is no longer an ancillary event but the primary event. Now it's not just X or other social media that's been taken over by the UK and the US so-called intelligence agencies to convince the gullible people that black is white and not to believe their own lying eyes. Plus, any media that deviates from the establishment narrative is now promoting Russia propaganda. Of course, the propaganda and disinformation campaign against Russia actually started way back in 2007, and it really took off after Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference. Now, that was when he stated that NATO's expansion was a danger and a threat to Russia and Europe's security, and that Russia's red lines were against Georgia and the Ukraine being admitted to NATO. Of course, then the comments were completely ignored, and then Saakashvili, the then Georgian president in 2008, decided that he was going to invade the ethnic Russian enclaves of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, in the meantime killing Russian peacekeeping troops before the Russians moved in, routed them in 4 days and sent them home defeated. Now, the Western media narrative was Russia attacks Georgia, and even to this day the media maintains this narrative despite an EU inquiry squarely laying the blame on the Georgians and the fact that Saakashvili thought NATO would help him. Now, this marked the beginning of all the Western media agencies becoming megaphones for the politicians and the security forces. After the Maidan coup in Kiev in 2014, the CIA set up shop in the city and became the major outlet for information using the disguise of the Kiev Independent that was neither independent or actually in Kiev, but the narratives manufactured in Langley and delivered to the useless and not so useful idiots masquerading as journalists. Now, this is similar to the online publication The Moscow Times. Not only is it not in Moscow, it's not even in Russia, but it's based in Amsterdam, and its funding comes from the Dutch government and the EU. Yeah, that's the Moscow Times. So how about this? In February, in a stunning disclosure, WikiLeaks revealed that the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has funded hundreds of media organizations over the years, raising concerns to anybody with a brain about the so-called independence of the press. Now, the renowned whistleblowing site posted on X, formerly Twitter, that USAID had financed over 6,200 journalists across 707 media outlets, as well as 279 media NGOs. Now, USAID funding in Ukraine has been particularly extensive, supporting 9 out of 10 media outlets in the country. Now, these outlets have been tasked with amplifying pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, pro-war narratives. 25 media organisations, including Stuff, NZME, Business Desk, News Hub, One News, have all received financial backing from USAID and Internews. However, the US freeze on foreign aid has had immediate consequences, with a large number of Ukraine media outlets announcing the suspension of their operations due to a loss of US funding. Anna Babinets, the CEO and co-founder of Slitsbo Info, a Kiev-based media outlet, emphasized that the impact of funding cuts were on her organization. She said, at Slitsbo Info, 90% of our budget comes from USAID, she said. Oksana Romanyuk, who's the Institute Director of Mass Information, shared her concerns about the funding freeze, highlighting the Ukraine's media's almost total reliance on foreign financial support. So as you can see, these so-called journalists are nothing more than propagandists for the government and the government narrative. And as part of this dynamic is the influence of the so-called intelligence agencies on the press. Now, currently, these are the world's largest funders of journalism, primarily through what was USAID. Now, it's all over the world, and the so-called news agencies, and I'm including here Bloomberg, Reuters, Agence France Presse, they're little more than prostitutes who only cover the establishment narrative. Now, as an example, back in December 2021, Vladimir Putin sent security documents to the United States and the NATO leaders. The points contained in these documents included a proposed treaty between Russia and the US, as well as an agreement on security measures for Russia and NATO member states. These documents outlined Russia's security concerns and its desire for talks on settling European security. Now, the proposed treaty, it said, a draft treaty on security guarantees between the Russian Federation and the United States was presented. Now, the security agreement, an agreement on measures that ensure the security of both the Russian Federation and NATO countries, was also included in these documents. Now, the context of these documents was the drafts were presented as a means of initiating dialogue and addressing the concerns regarding European security, particularly within Ukraine. Now, Russia called for discussions of matters such as the deployment of intermediate missiles in Europe and advocating for a fair and sustainable balance of interests. Now, don't forget, Russia was still trying to negotiate with the West, despite being duped not once but twice by Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, which Angela Merkel admitted were just a disguise to arm and prepare the Ukraine to attack Russia. Yet the Western media narrative since then is Russia woke up one day and decided to launch an unprovoked attack on its neighbour. And unfortunately, many in the gullible West have swallowed that narrative whole. Well, what actually happened? Well, the proposal was totally ignored by the Western media, and Russia became aware that the Ukraine was preparing to attack on the ethnic Russian provinces in the Ukraine of the Donbass, the Lugansk and Donetsk provinces. Now, realizing the danger, Russia immediately welcomed these regions into Russia, so they had the ability under the UN Charter, the responsibility to protect. Now, just remember that the Ukraine's Azov Nazis had been shelling and attacking the Donbass regions for 8 years, having killed over 15,000 people, including 6,000 children. Now, Russia poured troops into Ukraine and moved forward, but they did signal they didn't want to conquer the whole of the Ukraine. They just wanted negotiations and peace. I mean, after all, Ukraine had been part of the Russian Soviet family for generations. So then we came to the Istanbul talks, where a principal agreement was reached and Russian forces withdrew back from around Kiev and stopped the major bombing of facilities. Now, the next move was interesting. This was when Boris the Buffoon Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, former Mayor of London, former editor of the Spectator magazine and columnist for the Daily Mail, plus a father of at least 8 children, many of them out of wedlock, is also a well-known useful idiot of the globalists. Remember, he was the man who claimed he would get Brexit done, but instead he got a Brexit in name only. I mean, I was at a press conference in Moscow where he was speaking alongside the inimitable Sergei Lavrov. And as usual, Lavrov was in fine form and Johnson, on the other hand, appeared to be a clown. I mean, he stated for the assembled Russian journalists and myself, "I am the first British Foreign Secretary named Boris." Now, the assembled Russian press pack looked at me and asked, "Well, what the fuck's he on about?" I said, he's on about nothing. His full name is Alexander the Faithful Boris Johnson, and he has no Russian connections whatsoever. His grandfather was Turkish, and he was born in America. Anyway, back to Istanbul. Just after the tentative agreements were reached in Istanbul, Johnson turned up in Kiev with assurances to the Kiev cokehead that the US and NATO would arm, train and fund the proxy war as long as the Kiev cokehead in his fancy dress stood firm and his army, aided by Russia, aided by the UN and NATO, fought on and would defeat Russia. After all, Doris reasoned, with the devastating sanctions and the military pressure, it would not be long before Russia would surrender and Putin would be banished and Russia would be reduced to being a small US vassal. Now, many in the Western media from February 2022 onwards managed to convince the people of the Europe and the US that Ukraine was winning and Russia was losing. Now, of course, it's become obvious that not only is the Ukraine being beaten worse than a red-haired stepchild in an orphanage, the EU economies are a busted flush and Ukraine is not actually winning and Russia's getting stronger and stronger. I mean, every week for the last 3 years, there's been a story in either The Economist, The Spectator, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, or the news agencies like Bloomberg or Reuters about how Russia's economy is going down the toilet. Now, as an aside, I'll tell you about an incident I had with Michael Bloomberg, the owner of the eponymous so-called news agency back in 1997. Now, I used to work with and not for his company, providing my Russian news and analysis over his platform and his terminals. But I found it limiting, so I started to explore alternatives. Now, one of my technical guys suggested I use the internet, and I asked, bearing in mind this was back in 1997, what the fuck is the internet? Well, he explained what it was, and well, we tried it and it worked. So I was in a meeting with Michael Bloomberg in his luxury offices in Park Avenue in New York. And he said, "Rod, stop fucking around with the internet as it's only for geeks and it's never going to catch on and be used by real business or commerce." So, of course, Michael Bloomberg has got it completely wrong. And, of course, the media backpedaling on Ukraine as much as politicians. I mean, in a recent interview, the lies, propaganda and manipulation of information continues. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, made a statement in an interview with the Bloomberg news agency that even seasoned internet misinformation peddlers and liars would be ashamed of. I mean, the French president declared that Russia spends a third of its budget on war, that it doesn't build hospitals, schools or roads, and it has no social policy or welfare. This is because Russia is waging war on the civilized world to confirm its status as a superpower. Now, the French president's deliberate dissemination of false information. Now, due to his position, it's obvious that Macron is aware of the realities of the Russian economy, or at least he should consider dismissing his aides if he's not. And it was actually supporting this supposition by Bloomberg. An agency that was once regarded as respectable but now voluntarily has become a purveyor of the usual crap and fake news. Now, the key points of the interview with Macron were reiterated in full and unchallenged. I mean, there was no effort whatsoever to verify the facts and figures being manipulated by Bloomberg and Macron. Now, it's possible to assume that the Elysee Palace and Bloomberg's editorial staff have simultaneously become completely unhinged and succumbed to the delusions of a schizophrenic nature. But however, this is not a prerequisite and it's not actually totally necessary, because if two formerly respected Western institutions, the French presidency and the American media, have begun to speak with one voice, it signifies a major shift in what is now termed the Euro-Atlantic globalist narrative. Now, this intention is so crudely expressed in this French president's interview and the Bloomberg publication. It means that the EU is prepared to jeopardize the well-being of its ordinary people across the nations and to pay for their imagined revenge on Russia with their lives. Now, it's vital that we acknowledge the geopolitical realities of the situation, which can be determined as the despair of the losers. It appears that the French president, the German chancellor, the Italian prime minister, the UK's such wanky or Starmer, and other European politicians have not fully understood the consequences of their confrontation that they initiate in order to try and punish Europe, but have had such an impact on the Europeans, the French citizens, the German taxpayers, and the considerably amiable, though no longer so, inhabitants of the Italian Apennines. I mean, in light of the current economic indicators in the EU industrial sector, it's evident that the conventional approach of media reporting has been characterized by the degree of subservience and lies. It's no longer able to achieve the desired impact. The people are not believing it. Now, it's for this reason that the former banker and current President Macron was selected to present the arguments in favour of the concept of poverty in the Garden of Eden, with the aim of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, and it didn't work. I mean, it's no longer possible to explain to the average person about the galloping inflation and energy prices by saying the age of abundance is over, because saying so would require setting a time frame for overcoming these so-called temporary difficulties. The populace, unlike the patricians, goes to the store every day and pays their bills, and if there's any money left over from food spending monthly, then they want to know why. And they want to know why, if prices will ever return to their previously lower levels. But since the globalist patricians couldn't care less about the populace and continue to lie to them, they'd rather try and fight with Russia than give honest answers. Meanwhile, while children go to bed in the UK and EU cold and hungry, the children in Russia are warm and well fed, as Russia didn't gamble their future on the Kiev cokehead. They decided that they would want to be independent. Anyway, thank you for watching. Do svidaniya, which is Russian for until I see you again, and may your God go with you. Thank you.